Dagote, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Veronica Hirsch. I'm Chokananda. From my mother, I'm Chiricahua Apache, and I'm honored to serve as the Career Readiness and Employment Student Programs Administrator at the American Indian College Fund. I joined the College Fund November 28th of 2022, so I'm very happy to report I've passed my 6-month mark at the College Fund. The time has really just flown by. Prior to joining the College Fund, I worked with my friend, now my boss, the Senior Program Manager of Career Readiness and Employment, Mr. Jack Soto. I worked with Jack for over a year and a half in a consultancy capacity. I still own my own business. I'm a staff of one still in that business called Colibri Connections, where I provide career coaching, consulting, facilitation services throughout Indian country. But I'm so thrilled to be able to share this time with you today, discussing a topic that is very close to my heart, which is a discussion about Indigenous relationality. And really, what does that mean? And how the definitions of Indigenous relationality are dynamic, they're not fixed, they're not static. They can be informed by specific cultural contexts, by native languages. They can be informed by, let's say, context within an educational setting or an employment setting, in a number of settings. And so today, I just want to offer to you and invite you to think about and perhaps discuss, especially in our chat section, feel free to use that, your ideas on this topic of Indigenous relationality. As I mentioned, for those of you who are just joining, if you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see 3 different tabs. One will be Event, My Agenda, and Session. If you click on the Session tab, you'll see 3 other subheadings, which are Chat, Polls, and People. Please go ahead and click on the Polls tab and go ahead and submit a response. That question in the poll is, what is one of your most important values? The ones that I have listed are not to imply that these are the most important, but these are values and concepts that I'm going to discuss today in this presentation, and I offer you to think about them. So you see the options to that question, what is one of your most important values? You can select respect, responsibility, reciprocity, relationship, reflection, or redistribution. So if you could please, as we continue through this presentation, go ahead and submit your responses, and I greatly appreciate it. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin. And thank you so much for those of you who said hello and offered your greetings in the chat as well. So this discussion, as I mentioned, is about this idea of discussing the various definitions that can exist when we talk about Indigenous relationality, and perhaps some effective ways to incorporate, to center whatever it is your work involves into using these principles and centering them in your practice. So whether you are a faculty person or a staff person at a high school, at a tribal college, at a mainstream university institution, whatever the case may be, to really contemplate ways that you can intentionally incorporate these principles into the work that you do to serve our scholars, our student community. And so at the College Fund, and in my current capacity, as I said, serving as the Career Readiness and Employment Student Programs Administrator, I've asked myself this question. My supervisor, Mr. Jack Soto, and I have discussed this at length, and also with our colleagues at the College Fund, really asking ourselves, in what ways can we use Indigenous relationality principles to foster transformative change in the lives, not only of the students, the scholars that we serve, but also to uphold the main objective of our mission. You can see our mission is short and to the point. And so we're not only trying to invest in Native students, but we also are doing this with the intent to help transform lives and communities. So the lives of not only students, but their family, their friends, their colleagues, their fellow tribal citizens, and the communities that we serve, predominantly Indigenous communities. So knowing that this is our mission, the question then became, and the discussion continues to evolve on this topic of how we can intentionally ground our work in Indigenous relationality principles so that we can help together to collaborate to achieve the goals of our mission to transform lives and communities. And so with that in mind, we thought about we should probably reframe what some of the outcomes are that we might have previously had when it came to career readiness and employment. You'll see some of the examples I give are specific to the work that I do, that we do in this space, but they can also be transposed into other settings. Again, whether it's a classroom setting, if you are a faculty person, whether at a high school or tribal college or university, I'll say TCU for short, or at a mainstream public institution, whatever the case may be. If you're a staff person at those institutions, maybe you are not directly teaching students in a classroom setting, but you are nonetheless working to positively impact students' lives. Perhaps you provide various types of student support services in your area of responsibility. So I'll be using examples that can relate to a broad range of those types of work responsibilities and work focus areas. So part of our discussion then became, how do we really mean what we say when we develop student-centered program models? And so with that in mind, really prioritizing then not only the needs of our students, but really listening to our students when they have things to say to us. And the way students very often, scholars communicate with us at the College Fund is through different types of surveys, providing written feedback, working even directly with some of our staff. Some of our scholars work directly with some of our college success coaches. Some of our scholars work directly with me and with my colleague and supervisor, Mr. Soto, as well, in areas pertaining to career readiness, to employment, to thinking about internships and fellowship opportunities, to thinking about additional opportunities for them to develop their professional skills and abilities when it comes to, let's say, a student-led project or a project that's focused on working within and collaborating within a tribal community. And so, again, we thought about developing these student-centered program models that really intentionally incorporate those Indigenous relationality principles. And so part of that is us focusing upon our scholars' personal development along their professional journey. So not just thinking about things of certain benchmarks that are still important. Has our scholar successfully submitted, let's say, a scholarship application? Has our scholar, let's say, satisfied all these different program components that maybe they're involved in a particular program that has certain requirements? But beyond that, thinking about, so as part of satisfying those requirements, what did that scholar gain in a personal way, in a professional way, that will go farther and further beyond, let's say, the particular requirements of that opportunity? And how can we help foster and support that growth and that development? And so with that in mind, we then thought about, well, there's all these different definitions. Many of them happen to start with the letter R. So we thought, well, what are the R's of Indigenous relationality? And as I said, we wanted to really listen to what our scholars had to say. And so we did. Back in 2021, the College Fund administered a survey, and we received close to, not quite, 1,500 responses. And one of the main responses that we received in answer to a question that we asked, which was, what is one of your main reasons for going to college, for attending a college or university? And overwhelmingly, about 75% of our, or perhaps a little bit more, but at minimum 75% of those 1,500 scholar feedbacks mention this idea of giving back to their communities, giving back to their tribal communities, giving back to Indian country, giving back to Native people, to Indigenous people broadly. And so we said, wow, we're really inspired and impressed by that as one of the primary motivations of our scholars, this idea of reciprocity, of not just receiving and taking, but also realizing that the flip side of that is to give back, to give of oneself out of a spirit of generosity and abundance. And so we said, well, we are going to be student-led and student-centered. That means we're going to listen to students. So we identified reciprocity as one of those really critically important R's of Indigenous relationality. There's an amazing book that was written by an Apasquaya Cree philosopher and scholar, professor, Dr. Sean Wilson. It was published in 2008. I can say without exaggeration that reading this book really transformed my life. And so this book is listed here, Research is Ceremony, Indigenous Research Methods. And in that book, Dr. Wilson, among many things, lists 4 R's that you see here in the red font. But even prior to that, discussion about these R's has existed for as long as some of our audience participants today have been alive. So back in 1991, there was some groundbreaking work by Kirkus and Barnhart who were talking about First Nations in higher education. And they identified their own set of four R's, as you see listed. And that has really served as inspiration for many Indigenous and non-Native scholars who are devoted to this topic of Indigenous relationality. So as recent as 2021, you can see that Montgomery and Blanchard in their work, Testing Justice, New Ways to Address Environmental Inequalities, include the four R's that Kirkness and Barnhart identified in their work in 1991, and added a few more. So they have seven R's, and those are listed there. And then even more recently in 2022, from an Indigenous science, technology, engineering, and math perspective, from a STEM perspective, you can see that the authors of the six R's of Indigenous research listed their own R's. And so I include these references not only to share this information, because I think all of these resources are enormously helpful. They've been very helpful to me as I consider what does it mean when we're talking about Indigenous relationality. But I also mention this to demonstrate that the R's I'm talking about today, this is not an exhaustive list. These are not the only R's that I think are important, but these are R's that we have just decided to focus upon, especially when we're discussing student-led and student-centered, heart-centered work for the scholars that we serve. And so here are some of the six R's and the definitions that we have chosen to incorporate and to use at the College Fund. And again, these definitions are not fixed. They are not the only definitions that are possible. In fact, these definitions are dynamic, meaning they can change, they can adapt, they should adapt to meet the needs of our scholars. Our scholar populations are going to differ from year to year, even from semester to semester. And so it's important we don't apply a copy-paste type of approach, but we use these maybe definitions as a starting point, and then we realize that they might need to be modified to really adequately and appropriately meet the needs, the desires, and even address the feedback from the scholars, from the students that we serve. So you see some of these definitions, and I won't go through and read them verbatim, but I will touch upon them. Respect, that idea of a thoughtful self-reflection. So respect not only for self, beginning with self, for all the things that make you who you are as an individual, your lived experience, intelligence, your passion, and so on, but really cultivating an appreciation for those same qualities in other people. So people who are your peers, people who might be your mentors, your work colleagues, even your supervisors, people within, let's say, classroom contexts, or within certain high school or college program contexts, and also beyond it, within the workplace, if you happen to already be employed in some type of area of work, whether that's part-time or full-time, thinking about, again, having appreciation for self and for others. As you see this definition of responsibility, it's that idea of really holding ourselves accountable, really holding ourselves to a high standard of accountability, of being trustworthy, of having a high degree of integrity, and of appreciating that in other people as well. And doing our utmost to uphold that type of commitment, the commitment that we first have to ourselves, to be honest with ourselves, honest with our skills, our abilities, our energy, our time commitments, and also being respectful and honoring those same types of responsibilities in other people. Reciprocity, as I already briefly touched upon, again, this was one of the defining features that our scholars that we at the College Fund serve have identified as really critically important to them, this idea of giving back. So having that wholehearted gratitude, that spirit of deep empathy. To be in a state of reciprocity, it's never about asking oneself, what's the bare minimum I can do to technically be in a state of reciprocity? That's not reciprocity. Reciprocity is this idea of having this wellspring of abundance, of being able and choosing to believe the best, not only in ourselves, but in other people. And although that might come across as naive, I will say that since for myself, speaking from my own experience, since intentionally putting that type of reciprocity attitude of gratitude into practice, I will say that it has allowed me to be more appreciative of the different styles, communication styles, learning styles, teaching styles of people around me, rather than feeling maybe frustrated of this doesn't meet my expectations or this is not my preferred learning or communication style. When I have that spirit of reciprocity, when I choose to center that as part of my work, as part of my focus, it does allow me to have a lot more grace and I think a lot more patience, even with my peers, my colleagues, my mentors, even my supervisor. And these are the last three definitions. So relationships. So this idea that in relationships, these are always opportunities for us to actively learn and teach, to engage with each other, to not just hear each other, but to listen, to actively listen, to think about how we can build this idea of collegiality. So seeing each other as colleagues, really kind of doing away even maybe with some of those distinctions of teacher student or mentor student or faculty student, but more so we are colleagues. We are choosing to engage in a learning environment together, whether that's a classroom environment, if you are a faculty person in a high school or college setting, or if that's another environment, let's say you provide support services to scholars, to students, or maybe you have a particular type of program. It might be a leadership development program. It might be a youth-focused program. But this idea of cultivating this atmosphere where we can respect and come to regard each other as colleagues from whom we can learn and to whom we are responsible to bring our best selves when we are trying to teach or to impart some type of new information. So it's this idea of utilizing our collective strength and capacity to create something that is really powerful and beautiful. So that idea that we are better together when we create healthy relationships. Reflection, as you can see, this idea of taking time, being intentional about sitting and thinking, really contemplating even what we're doing today, thinking about what these definitions are, even in that poll, which again, if you haven't taken the poll yet, you can look on the right side of your screen under session, you'll see chat, polls, and people. You can please go ahead and take that poll. So this idea of taking time to be intentional about thinking what matters to me and why. Where did I come up with that? Was that taught to me and by whom? Parents, teachers, friends, society at large. What are some of the assumptions that I have? Are those assumptions based in some type of evidence or fact? Are those assumptions based on an opinion? Are those assumptions maybe even based upon a certain stereotype? Do I need to rethink things that I thought about that I thought were true before? So this idea of just not having a passing thought, this idea of being really intentional. Sometimes people call it a contemplative practice or a meditative practice. This idea of intentionally setting aside time to think deep thoughts, to think about these things, to examine our own actions, the consequences of those actions, to think about how all of those things add up to help us tell and relate our personal story. And how in doing that, when we commit to that as a practice, when we have an opportunity to share those thoughts that we have, that time of self-reflection, maybe we have time in a group context to say, well, this is what I've been thinking about. What's your opinion? What's your insight? Do you have anything else to share? Where together we can, again, collectively come up with ways where we can not only improve our lives as individuals, but let's say in the case of a class or a course or a program, we can ensure that that class, course, or program can continually improve so that future scholars or students or participants benefit from the improvements that have been made. And so that this continues. This is an ongoing process so that we are laying the foundations for positive futures and outcomes for people who are in the next cycle, let's say, of that course or program or project. And so we're paying it forward. Again, this kind of loops back into what we've already discussed, that idea of reciprocity. And finally, redistribution. So that idea that we're not going to be stingy with the gifts or the talents or the insights that we receive, but we're going to be intentional about sharing these broadly with other colleagues, let's say in a classroom setting, a work setting, within, let's say, a college environment or high school environment. That even beyond those walls, we're going to think about how do some of these concepts or how does some of this information relate beyond, let's say, a classroom context or a university, college context? How might this be beneficial, let's say, to my family, to my friends, to my tribal community, and even larger than that, the world. So this idea of when we find out additional information that is beneficial, that is useful, that is helpful, that we're able to share those lessons learned, that we're able to share those resources that we've heard about and accessed, and we thought that they were really beneficial and helpful, and that we're able to share this. So that idea of that ripple effect of how we are not the sole beneficiaries, let's say, of that positive thing, but that this radiates outward and this can positively impact the lives of people, even generations from now, people that we may have yet to meet or we may never meet. But again, this idea of redistribution, how we can continue to spread the positive impact of the things that we have learned, that we have been able to use and utilize, and how that can radiate outward to be of benefit to a broader community. And so one of the questions, as I mentioned, for us at the College Fund is asking ourselves with a reflection, our reflection, how can we help nurture our scholars, our journey? And so part of that was really, again, centering our scholars' college going motivation. As I said before, the primary motivation, over 75% of our scholars that were polled, almost 1,500 people polled, said that reciprocity, that desire to give back, is one of their most important college going motivating factors. And so one of the things we've done is we've provided our scholars with the dynamic definitions for these 6 R's that I mentioned. And we're inviting our scholars to reflect. We're inviting our scholars to define their core values, what values mean to them. So not just the ones that I included in that poll, there might be other core values that you have, or the scholars, the people with whom you work and interact have. And to visualize your academic and professional goals as you think about what your core values are. Do your core values align with what you think you want to achieve or accomplish along your academic and professional journey? And how that might help you outline some of those goals, and to also consider what qualities make, and you see in quotes, a good professional relative. So we talk a lot, in our different contexts, our tribal cultures, about being a relative and the types of relationships that we have with other humans, with other beings, with other relatives in the animal world, plant world, natural world, and so on. And so extending that type of conversation further and thinking, well, being a good relative doesn't just begin and end in those contexts, but it also happens within, let's say, the classroom or the workplace. And so thinking about how I choose to show up, how I make it a daily practice to show up as a good professional relative. What does that look like for me? How do I expect myself to behave? How do I hope and wish others will behave towards me? And so part of that practice of thinking about what does it mean to show up and to be or to behave or to become a good professional relative is developing different types of practices. So one of the ones that we have offered and provide here is this idea of a reciprocity reflection. And so this can be for self, this can be for students, this can be for somebody in a workplace, thinking about, again, how I choose to show up in the world as a good professional relative. And so part of this reciprocity reflection, it's really helpful for me to think about what is important about my story. What do I want people to know about me? Why do I want them to know about me? What does this mean in a larger sense of not just my story, but what might this mean in terms of being helpful to other people? And so part of that reflection, that kind of daily practice, is to decide not only what I want to give, but also what I want to receive. So again, in order for there to be balance, there has to be this dual aspect of reciprocity. Not just giving, giving, giving endlessly, and not just taking, 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 but giving and receiving in equal measure. And part of this reflection also involves, as I mentioned previously, centering my core values, thinking about how those core values align with my professional plan. If one of my core values is to have close relationships, of a personal, professional nature, that I really want to intentionally cultivate. And for me to do that, I'm thinking about, let's say, being honest with myself about the energy, the capacity I have to invest into a close, let's say, professional relationship. Chances are that I'm going to say, well, my close professional relationships, the ones that I really want to invest in, I can maybe invest in maybe 10 to 15 or 15 to 20. That's great. Thinking about how that might align with my professional goals. Would it make sense for me to work in a really large organization where I'm expected to nurture, professional relationships with hundreds of people? Or would it make more sense for me to work for maybe a smaller organization where I'm responsible to nurture relationships with people maybe, 20 or so or 30 or so? And so thinking again about whatever my personal core values are, whatever I define as being really important to me, how does it align with my professional goals? Things that are important to me that I want to consider. If one of my, let's say, academic goals as a student is to nurture really close personal professional relationships with my faculty, with my campus staff, that might be a little bit harder to achieve, let's say, at a large mainstream institution that has like 40,000 students. Not that it's impossible, but I might have to go about that practice in kind of a unique way, versus maybe I might have a bit more ease and flexibility of nurturing those close professional relationships, personal relationships, let's say with faculty, with my classroom colleagues, with campus staff, at maybe a smaller university setting. So again, thinking about what is important to me, not being persuaded by somebody else's opinion of that, but really centering my core cultural values and think how those align with my professional plan. And as I mentioned, it can be very helpful to cultivate a reciprocity daily practice. And you can see the benefits of that. When I start my day, in that state of reciprocity, thinking about not just what I want to give, but also what I want to receive, that's going to help me hopefully be able to communicate more clearly, more transparently, with greater accountability to the people around me. It's also going to help me prioritize what I want to accomplish that day. I'm not going to be able to get to everything every day, every week, every year, but it will help me prioritize what is really critical for me to address in a given day. And again, making sure that I'm giving and receiving to people around me. If somebody is expecting, a timely response from me, then maybe I need to prioritize that response in my given day versus waiting to respond to that person at the end of the week. It can also help me identify what I can do on my own, what resources I have at hand, the skills, the knowledge, the abilities. It also helps me figure out where I have gaps, where I need assistance, where I need to ask clarifying questions of people around me, my supervisor, my colleague, my instructor, and so on. And as part of this reflection, again, this loops back into that type of personal storytelling narrative. When I have this reciprocity reflection and I cultivate a daily practice of reciprocity, this helps me cultivate resiliency so that when I have challenges and obstacles, because I will, and in our previous session, we heard from our keynote, Mr. Corey Gray, when I fail, because I will, instead of seeing that as, let's say, devastating, as a devastating situation from which I can never recover, I can say, okay, I didn't perform the way I wanted to. So what do I need to do to equip myself for the future so that I can perform the way that I want to? Who do I need to ask for help? What are some clarifying questions I need to ask? And that helps me cultivate a sense of resiliency so that even when I have problems, because I will, even when I have challenges, because I will, even when I fail, because I will, I'm still resilient in the face of those types of challenges. And they don't feel like insurmountable obstacles, but instead they feel like, okay, tests really of my skills and opportunities for me to grow. And so part of that resiliency also helps me to show up as my authentic self. It helps me to show up in any context, any situation as my genuine authentic self. Now, I might feel nervous. I might feel a little bit overwhelmed. But again, I have that resiliency to back me up, to know that I am choosing to show up as a good relative. And so knowing that, I can enter that situation, even if it's a new one, with a certain degree of confidence. And that authenticity can energize me to, share with people who I am. We often hear this elevator pitch, maybe 20 seconds or so, to talk about who you are, what you're about, and why anyone might care or be interested. And so part of that is really conveying, what my core values are, what's important to me, how do I choose to show up as my authentic and genuine self. And all of these things add up to a very powerful set of Indigenous transferable skills. Very often within higher education or even in certain employment spaces, we hear discussion around hard skills and soft skills. And hard skills might include something like having specific training, working with, let's say, specialized computer equipment or specialized computer software. A soft skill has often been seen as like interpersonal skills. So let's say public speaking skills or time management skills. But I would offer all those skills require a certain level of expertise and talent. So I'm not going to call them hard skills or soft skills. I think they're all challenging to cultivate, so they're all relevant. But what I'm talking about when it comes to Indigenous transferable skills, I'm inviting you to think about how you might create a reciprocity daily practice, how you might choose to incorporate these 6 R's into your daily life as part of being a good professional relative, and how that powerfully sets you up to be a good professional relative. And that is a set of Indigenous transferable skills. So within the context of the work that I do here at the College Fund with my colleagues, some of the ways that we have chosen to incorporate the 6 R's into actual practice include how we design programs. So including the 6 R's definitions in language that I previously showed in, let's say, your course or your program component descriptions and explanations. And so when we do that, the scholars that we serve, whether those are students or participants in a program, we're demonstrating the responsibility we have to them to show up in authentic ways, to uphold those 6 R's. We're demonstrating the responsibility that we expect them to uphold to us as well. And in doing so, we're creating a healthy foundation for building strong, sustainable relationships. We hear this a lot about providing wraparound services. And so to do that, to uphold a wraparound services approach with faculty and staff, we can again share those definitions, those language, that language in those course and program component descriptions. We can share them with our colleagues to say, this is the way I've chosen to define or incorporate this into my course or my program. What do you think? And that can lead to the discussion, the ways in which those 6 R's can relate to other campus colleagues' core values. Let's say to your institution's core values, whether you're working at a high school or tribal college or university or mainstream institution in a workplace, whatever the case may be. And within that, that allows us once again to craft that type of healthy relationship where there's open and honest, transparent communication, where there's that spirit of reciprocity of I'm providing, the ways in which I apply this in my course or my program, and trusting that you'll do the same, that you'll reciprocate that as well. And creating that flow of communication, again, having respect for other people's time, for their preferred communication styles and formats and frequency, and having a responsibility, again, to uphold those clear lines of communication, to not make assumptions, but to ask those clarifying questions, to ask in what context, with what frequency people are interacting, faculty and staff are interacting with scholars, in what ways our campus colleagues can effectively support those interactions. So it's not just about what I do in my own little area of responsibility, but how can what I do in my area maybe inform, support, or help or assist what somebody else does in their area of responsibility. In terms of program delivery, we can think about how we want to help our scholars show up as their authentic selves. So again, our responsibility to scholars to explain, why these R's exist, why the dynamic definitions are as explained or presented as they are, to administer different types of surveys to help scholars to really kind of see where they're at. What did they understand maybe at the beginning of a course or a program? After completing that, what do they now understand to be true at the end? And how this can also help scholars to more clearly understand why certain activities are designed the way they are and why certain expectations are built into that course or program. So again, there's that responsibility that's shared among everyone, and there's that opportunity for everybody involved to reflect upon their experience and their responsibility to each other. For faculty and staff, again, as I mentioned in that previous slide, that ability to reflect upon, how we're going to intentionally incorporate these R's into our course or program, how that incorporation helps meet the activities and expectations, and how they can be helpful to achieving those particular benchmarks. And then to also identify areas maybe where collaboration among colleagues between and among courses or programs is feasible and possible. And then even in getting to things like assessing the efficacy, let's say, of how a particular expectation or course requirement helped a scholar. So realizing that relationship is important throughout this entire process. And so you can see some of the ways that can be upheld here. And again, these R's show up in various ways. And then finally, when we're thinking about the evaluation, so how well did a course or a program engage a scholar? Again, all of the R's underpin this work. And so you see at the bottom, this kind of applies more specifically, let's say, to a college context. This may or may not apply to your own type of program evaluation, but it's possible. And since I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip to this slide. This is my last slide with content. So the ways that we feel, that we believe the 6 R's inform our student-centered work practices and dynamic narrative is we have respect for our scholars, their reciprocity focus. We have that responsibility to help our scholars transform lives and communities. We center reciprocity in action by prioritizing our scholars' feedback because we want to continuously improve the programs that we offer to our scholars. We want to continue to develop and cultivate healthy relationships with our scholars, with tribal colleges and universities, with some of our employer partners and mentors, and among our own college staff. We encourage reflection that helps us focus on how we can help our students show up authentically. And lastly, we have this commitment to redistribution, to share the resources that we have, all the resources that we have available at the College Fund to not only our scholars, but to people throughout Indian country. And with that, this is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. And with that, I will say, thank you. If you have any questions, I think we're going to get a little breakthrough in a moment. But if you're still here in the room and you wanted to ask something in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and type that into the chat. Thank you so much. So thank you for some of the questions in the chat. So my colleague Jenna asked, do you offer this training as consult work? And I will speak not as a College Fund employee, but as a person who has my own consulting business. As an individual, yes, I do provide this training in a consultancy capacity. In response, though, to Ashley's question of, do you all ever review programs and provide feedback on how those specific programs can be better? Speaking as a College Fund employee, myself and my supervisor, Mr. Jack Soto, we do not, as College Fund employees, review programs and provide feedback on how those programs can maybe improve in specific areas. But again, speaking as a private individual, as an independent consultant, I would say this way, I don't necessarily feel I'm in a position to tell anyone any program of any type, this is what you need to do better. But I do facilitate discussion sessions where people who are part of that particular program can define for themselves what they want to do better. So I guess I reframe that question in the sense of I refrain from projecting my own opinion upon somebody else or a community of which I'm not a part to say, well, this is how you guys should do this better. But instead, I am really appreciative of having facilitated conversations with people who comprise that community to say, you know your community best. You do, versus some outsider. And so, what do you think is important? And I'm thrilled to participate, to help facilitate, to lead those types of conversations for people who are interested in having them. So hopefully that answers your question. As a college fund, do we do that? No, we don't provide that type of service at this time. But as I mentioned, as an individual, those are some of my favorite conversations. Thank you for those questions. Those are great. Are there any other questions? Maybe even was there a value that you did not see in the poll that you think, wow, this should have really included this. I like this value a lot. Because that also helps me think about, reframe and consider things that maybe I hadn't previously. And again, that poll really just touched upon the 6 R's that I outlined in this presentation. And I encourage you, if you haven't yet accessed the expo, to please make sure that you do that. There are a wealth of resources there. And yeah, if there's nothing else, I'm just going to wish all of you a wonderful day. I'll just stay in here because I feel weird about leaving first. But if there's not anything else, thank you so much for your time and your attention. I so appreciate it. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.